Hey folks, today I'm very excited to bring you an update to my Frostclaw Spark Charge Sorcerer. After leveling to 100 in less than 3 days, I can confirm it's actually a very strong build, probably one of the strongest mage builds in the game. For a little bit of context on what I did, I started the 1.1 league as mage, I leveled with some friends, I got to 50, and then I immediately swapped into the Frostclaw build before I even had Enigma, and it was immediately extremely strong. I was doing by far the most damage in the group. I was also the most tanky, and I was able to carry quite a few of the bosses, even through 4-man HP early on. From then, even though I did screw around a bit, I still managed to achieve a rank 4 Sorcerer finish, even though I stopped to do 8 Harbingers, I pushed one timeline up to almost 500 corruptions, and I took 2 10-hour breaks. My pace from 99 to 100 was actually 3.5 hours, so incredible map clear pace, even with suboptimal COF gear that I have. As you can see, we're still using the set rings. We didn't find any useful exalts to slam into the LP items that we did get, and everything else is basically whatever I found with stats that I had. The legendaries that I do have were from the Nemesis mechanic, and they didn't end up providing any useful affixes anyway, but in the end it didn't even matter. The build was just strong enough to carry me through all the content. Anyway, if you like this sort of thing, this sort of build, please leave a like on the video, as it is the best way to support me, and a lot of time and effort went to putting this together. Let's jump into an echo real quick to show some gameplay. This is at about 400 corruption, and we are currently using day 3 budget gear. So this is all COF found gear that I found by the 3rd day of playing this character. So you can see for the most part, when we're fighting packs of enemies, we just need to click once or twice, and the overlapping AoE of the spark charges will basically kill everything. The gameplay is pretty simple for this build, you don't need to do much. Board levels are generally high. We have basically perfect AoE. The single target is still quite strong, not as strong as some of the very overpowered builds, but I think the gear scaling on this build with int giving us a bunch of flat damage and increased damage and all that stuff, eventually with the right gear this will be an extremely strong single target boss killing build as well, but even now it's already quite strong in that aspect. We have the Moonspire. Just want to get pretty close for more damage, and you can see it is still quite high, even on the single target. We'll do this Nemesis here too. We'll do one more since that one was pretty quick. One thing to keep note is as long as you continue to cast your Meteor each time you use Teleport, you generally won't have any mana problems. What's really nice about the build is even the rares with the auto-targeting, you can kind of just kite past them and click a few times, and you don't really need to engage with them very much. It really makes this a very mobile build. So you don't need to be close to enemies to kill them, you don't need to target them or anything. You can kind of just shut your brain off and dash through the maps very quickly, as I already did, considering I walked right by that spire there. Oops. And go back around to the other one that we missed. And we have another Nemesis. Why not? There we go. That's pretty much it. Might as well also show a boss while we're here. This is a 400 Corruption ARGENTUS. See, we dumped a bunch of our mana there, got up to around 8,000 ward. And we're back. Here we go. Let's just get some DPS in on the boss. We can tank most of this, but I'm not gonna play with fire. Before we talk about endgame, let's talk a little bit about leveling and progression. I'll be including this planner in the description, which contains the minimum reasonable entry level for this build. It has the passive progression, so if you're looking for any progression of which passives to take in what order, this is what it is. The minimum to get started with this build specifically is 64 passive points. Once you have that, you can put 20 into Mage to unlock Sorcerer, and then 40 in Sorcerer to unlock Arcane Current, and then 4 points into that to get 100% Spark Charge chance. This is the keystone of the build, and the minimum required to get started. If you already have a leveled Sorcerer, you can use this planner as a reference for what passives and also what skills to level, as well as progression, and you can skip ahead in the video to the next segment now. If you don't already have a leveled Sorcerer, I strongly recommend leveling with the Glacier Sorcerer guide written by Tarek on Maxroll. This is the guide that I personally used while leveling my Sorcerer in the 1.1 League Start. Was very strong, I had no issues, and the transition was extremely smooth as most of the items and passives were already fairly similar. This build will take you to around mid-50s with no problems, which is the point that you can switch into the Frostclaw build. Once you've switched into the Frostclaw build, it's very important that you make sure your Frostclaw costs at least 40 mana, as the passive node in the Sorcerer tree has that as the minimum for the Spark Charge to apply. To make sure that it is actually applying the Spark Charges, you need to follow along this passive tree and grab all of the nodes that increase the mana cost of Frostclaw, all the way up to around 42. It is really important that you're mindful of the mana costs of Frostclaw, as in the game it may actually say 40, but the UI always rounds up. So if it says 40, it's probably 39.6 or something, and you're not going to be getting Spark Charges. To make that a little bit easier for you, I've included this calculator in the description that will go over what passives and points you can actually allocate to get your mana where it needs to be. Here you can see Frostclaw needs to have, if you have a -3 on your weapon, it needs to have at most 1 point in Gift of Winter. Otherwise, it will be under 40 mana and it won't work. So here we have 1 point in Gift of Winter. You have all the extra mana costs and no mana efficiency on the idols or in the skill tree. This is very, very important. Otherwise, it won't work. If you have something with -4 for reference, you would need to have no points in Gift of Winter to make sure that your mana cost is still above 40. The other extremely important thing to know about this build and how it functions is that we sustain our heavy mana cost of Frostclaw, which is 42 mana per cast, through a combination of Mana Strike, Meteor, and Teleport. The way it works is basically, say you're missing a bunch of mana, you just cast Teleport and then Meteor right after and you recover a bunch of mana. We also have the Mana Strike to recover a little bit of extra mana while fighting bosses for when Meteor and Teleport is not enough. Usually it is, but if it isn't, you have this as a backup. So this gives a huge amount of mana gained. It's something like almost 200 mana on bosses. You can see here if I hit the boss, there we are back at full mana. Really good stuff. This is very, very important to understand for the build, otherwise you will always be running out of mana. Another cool trick for you guys that is purely optional but can give you a bit more damage. If you take advantage of the auto-targeting properties of Frostclaw, so for a little context, we have Frozen Malice, targets a random enemy that is 3 to 9 meters away. So 3 meters here is the minimum range. If you intentionally aim away from the enemy and use this auto-targeting to your advantage, you'll actually get a little bit more damage. This is very useful for a single target. You're fighting bosses. If you want to maximize your damage, you stand as close as possible and you aim about 4 meters away. And not only will the auto-targeting bounce back through the enemy, but the normal bounces back from the final node here, which gives an additional cast back towards you. That'll also go through the enemy and give you some extra hits. So not strictly necessary for you to do this, but if you're running through maps and you want to aim a little bit away from the enemies, you will get more damage. If you want to maximize your boss damage, you stand right up on them and you aim a bit away, you get significantly more damage. If you're interested in understanding how this works in more detail, I will include a link to a video I made in the past in the description of this one. Before we jump into the skills and passives, I'm going to talk a little bit about gear, as it'll make everything that comes after make a lot more sense. So as I said before, the Enigma is not mandatory to start playing this build, but you will want to get it as soon as possible. You can do this through using Rune of Ascendance on Catalysts, or through the Nemesis mechanic, or through Prophecies, or the Bazaar if you're Merchant Guild. All of these things are very important. You want to rush this. If you don't have this, you want to be using a staff with as much base damage as possible, as that will apply to the spark charges. Once you have Enigma, you'll notice that it says +2 flat lightning damage per intelligence. This is what we're building around. You want to get as much intelligence as possible. Intelligence also gives you, per point, 4% increased damage, 4% ward retention, 3% spell crit, and 0.5% of cast speed if you're using the ladle. So getting as much int as possible, as soon as possible, is the #1 priority for this build. The other high priority for this build, as far as stats and affixes, is getting as much mana as possible. That helps a lot with the Archmage here, which gives you mana regen once you reach thresholds. And it also makes managing the mana pool of your Frostclaw, which costs a lot, much easier. The other benefit is you get much more ward gain back from Lost Knowledge. So here you get 1/3 of your current mana back. And if you are high mana when you cast a skill, that could be upwards of 300 ward every cast. To help with setting up your character, I'll also be including this spreadsheet that goes over all the useful information about the build. This will help you figure out which affixes, items, blessings, and idols that you want to use. There will also be resources here at the top that I will be keeping up to date. The TLDR of the affixes is that the #1 priority wherever you can possibly get it is intelligence. That scales everything. After that, we have spell crit. That's spell crit chance, crit multiplier. These are very important. We also want to get as much mana as possible. We want to get mana spent gained as ward. For defenses, we also want to get our resists as capped as possible. And we also want reduced crit damage taken because we already have some in the Runemaster tree, so it's much easier to synergize that with more on our gear rather than going for crit avoidance. For items, there's a lot of different uniques that you could possibly use. I've included all of them here, and there's a little keynote here on the right that includes why each item is good or useful. I've also included different levels of gear for each possible progression stage. So we've already talked a little bit about my character. Let's now talk about what I think a mid-tier gear would look like. So jumping right into that, you can see this is what I think a mid-tier level gear would look like. For a more min-maxed variant, I have another one here that has red rings. This gives you a bunch of resists and also extra int in all attributes. Now let's talk in a little bit more detail about the skills. Mana Strike, as I said, will be useful during leveling and continue to be useful in endgame as a periodic boost of mana if you're ever low. The main point of taking the skills, you grab everything that increases your mana and grab the double mana gain plus cooldown so that you don't need to spam it. This is just something that you occasionally use if you find yourself low on mana for whatever reason. You aren't going to be spamming this in maps because it is melee range. Meteor, the same idea applies here. You are using it purely for a refund. You always just cast it every time you cast Teleport right after for a boost of mana using the recovery tech. So you make Meteor free, then you use the recovery, you make the mana cost as high as possible. Here we have it over 200, and then you get back over 150 mana. This isn't something that you're going to be spamming. You literally just use it every time you cast Teleport, immediately cast Meteor right after. Teleport, same idea. It's part of the Meteor refund tech. So Mana Tunnel is what you need. You want your cooldown as low as possible, and everything else you have in points, you just want to use for buffs. Everything here is optional beyond the Mana Tunnel tech. So once you have to here, all the cooldown and Mana Tunnel, You can put these points where you want. I just chose to put them in stun immunity and armor and a bit of extra duration on the buffs. So that is something that you could do. You could also give extra ward per cast, but because the cooldown's kind of high, I decided to go with extra buff duration and buff quality here. For my flex point, I picked the flame ward. I'm mainly using this as a ward generator here. You could use it as a damage sponge if that's what you prefer. It's really up to you, but yeah, I just went with everything here that gave extra ward. If you're fighting a boss or something and you need a boost of ward, you'll get over 1,000. It will give you a panic button to help you survive that. I also went into some DR here, so if you see a big hit incoming, you can get a boost of ward and reduce the damage. For Frostclaw, the main thing here is that you increase your cost, as we said earlier. With the extra points, I make it lightning, and I also go into the Shiver Shell here, which gives ward gained on cast by any method, so these 5 casts total is going to give you 60 ward each time you cast Frostclaw. Pretty significant. With the extra points, these are sort of flex. There wasn't a whole lot useful you could do. So at this point, you could either go into Ellie Nova if you want. I personally didn't think it was worth it. Or you can go into the Railwind's Veil here for extra ward per freeze rate, and then grab a little bit of extra freeze rate here. With your additional points, if you want to use Focus, you can do that. So if you choose you don't really like Flame Ward, Meteor, Mana Strike, and you want to try something different, you can do the out of mana focus tech. So you just go this way on the tree, and then you can get 40% of your max mana taking these sets of nodes here when you're negative. So you just spam your skills as much as possible. When you go negative, you just tap focus and you get back 40%. If you have about 1,000 mana, that would be 400. You can use this as an alternative to teleport, meteor, and mana strike if you find those are clunky or you don't enjoy using them. This is an option for mana recovery. Personally, I found it was a little bit annoying to use, but you may prefer it. Another thing that could also be an option is you could take Ice Barrage. This gives many, many hits per cast, and it could be a huge boost to your single target damage. If you want to drop maybe Flame Ward or something like that, you can run Ice Barrage. There's, I don't know how many hits exactly, but I think spec'd correctly, this could be over 30. So this is something that you can do. Another potential option here, if you're using Dragorith Claw, you definitely want Lightning Blast. You'll go into the nodes here that give you spark charges. You get instant destination, which is very nice. And you can also go down here, grab Lightning Aegis. It will break when you take damage to your ward. It says when you lose 25% of your health. It does mean take that much damage to anything. So even though you're taking damage to your ward, you will still lose your Lightning Aegis almost every time you get hit. So yeah, those are the options for skills. Feel free to play around with some other stuff. I think Snap Freeze could also be a nice quality of life. You can even use it as a buff for extra armor at all times if you want. You just grow into armor and then grab the nodes that increase the cooldown. So that'll give you armor and cold resist. Cold resist is the lowest resist we have because we have some other stuff buffing our lightning and fire. So this is also nice. Yeah, feel free to experiment with that and let me know what you think works. Moving over to passives, I'm explaining the basic passive tree used in the initial swap build. So the endgame builds will be almost exactly the same. Anyway, the main thing here is we want to get as much int as possible. So you'll see I take almost every int node. We start here taking int. We grab a bit of cooldown here on teleport. We don't care that much about cast speed. And then we go over here to grab the extra mana, just taking us to 20 points so that we can unlock Sorcerer. Here you can see we have a little bit more crit. Then we go into the Sorcerer tree. This is where all the good stuff is. We have our int here. We have a bit of mana stuff here. This is very important. You want to grab this as early as possible because you ward per second based on your max mana. While leveling, this is an extremely strong node. You go in here. This gives you ward gained per current mana when you cast a skill. We're casting 40 mana skills quite often, so this is a lot of your ward. Then we grab this crit. This is doubled for lightning skill, so this 80% is actually 160%. This is a crazy amount of crit chance, and with the base crit we have from either Prismatic Gaze or the Phantom Grip rings, this is 20% crit chance per node. It's a lot. Then we have int here and a bit of ward decay threshold. Obviously we need int, but the decay is not bad as a little bonus. This is the key node for the build. It also gives us more damage to shocked, which is nice. But the main thing here is we're getting spark charge chance. Here we get cooldown. This gives us a lot more teleport freedom. So we get to use it more often, which is a bit of mobility, and it also gives us more refunds with Meteor. This is very nice. This gives us increased mana, which it's generally hard to get, and it also gives us mana spent gained as ward. So this is also very useful. Archmage here is another very strong one, gives us a little bit of flat damage, which isn't a huge deal, but the big thing is it gives us a chance to refund 20% of mana cost. If you have this build to 1000 mana, that would be 105%. So what that basically means is that you are refunding a little bit over 20% of the mana cost for free. And for Meteor that costs over 200 mana, that's an extra 40-ish, a little bit more than 40 per cast of Meteor, and then each Frostclaw, you get a little bit of boost to that too, and all your teleports and flame wards. All of this gives you a little bit more mana back every time you cast. This adds up quite a bit while you're fighting bosses or running echoes, so don't underestimate this node. In the Runemaster tree, we go through here to the reduced bonus damage taken from crits. This is still a really good node, even with the nerf, and it makes getting the rest of it from our gear a little bit easier. This is always working for us because we are always using a catalyst. Otherwise, here we have some damage reduction. This helps a lot because you're taking less damage is generally good. And then otherwise, we just have our mana here, and we have int and ward gain on direct spellcasts. This is one of the better various int nodes that we get as well, because it actually gives us a benefit. Here we have Spellblade. The only thing here that we take is int. We get int and ward gain on melee, which we don't do, but it also gives us ward decay threshold per int, which is nice. If you really want more int, you can go into this node here. You would need to take an extra 2 points here to get to it. I don't really think it's worth it. It'd be pretty inefficient. Anyway, that's pretty much it for the video. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.